Good afternoon. Thanks for long introduction, and many thanks to Dr. Prabdeep, Dr. Mudhekar, and the entire organizing team for asking me to be here. The topic, I was asked to speak on a topic related to infectious disease, and the topic that I have chosen today is hepatitis C, primarily because in my professional career, from the time that I started, I did my DM till now, there has been a huge change in this one disease. And I thought that reflects what is possible if public health professionals get together and along with the scientists, and how things can change, and that's why I've chosen this topic. So, when I was an undergraduate, or let me start it another way, viral hepatitis is a disease that we have known from before the birth of Christ. Even in literature from BC era, we can find mention of viral hepatitis. And somewhere during wars, it was realized that a lot of outbreaks of viral hepatitis occurred when there was water contamination, when there was crowding, and it was thought that those were enterically transmitted cases. Somewhere in the first half of the 20th century, when yellow fever vaccine started to be used, in particular during the Second World War, it was realized that those soldiers who got immunized with the yellow fever vaccine, which came from humans, they developed hepatitis, so it was clear that this was also being transmitted by a parenteral route. So the terms were coined. Some people called them MS1, MS2. They were called hepatitis A and B. Somewhere in the 1970s, the tests for hepatitis A and B became available, and it was realized that there were cases of hepatitis A and B they were causes of viral hepatitis which were not due to either of the two viruses. For want of a better name, non-A, non-B hepatitis, NA-NB hepatitis, or NA-NBH was the term coined. So this is a paper that appeared in 1989, the year that I was finishing, a few months before I finished my gastroenterology training, when for the first time, from people who had had post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis, a part of the viral genome was identified. It became clear that this was an RNA virus, and shortly thereafter, using the new technology, so you do PCR, you do clone, and then you find an RNA, you clone it, and then you express it to produce a protein, and that was used to detect antibodies in the sera of patients suspected to have that disease. And we had, this was 1989, by 1990 we had a test which was not as good, but over the next 2-3 years the test was refined, and we had tests for antibodies. So that's the discovery, only about 30 years ago. So we now knew, and this was called as hepatitis C because it was parenterally transmitted but not B. Also similarly, the next year in 1990, a virus was identified which was known as the hepatitis E virus, but this is enterically transmitted, and I'm not going to go into this. And a small proportion of cases even today remain unclear. So I'm going to talk to you about this, the hepatitis C virus today. There were some indications, but once test became available, it was done in different cohorts of healthy people, different cohorts of patients, and it became clear that this infection was caused by healthcare associated procedures, in particular transfusion of blood and blood products, through unsafe injection practices, through other healthcare procedures such as transplantation, dental procedures, needle stick injuries, and the infection was also transmitted through unsafe injections in non-healthcare settings, meaning intravenous drug use, tattooing, body piercing. The other routes of transmission which were fairly important for hepatitis B were not as important for hepatitis C. And surely there were people who had inapparent infection where the route could not be found. But we believe that there must be some way for blood from the infected person to enter into the body of the uninfected person and get the infection to be transmitted. Also, because the test became available, we came to know the seroprevalence of this infection in different populations. And this is the data from the entire world. We can see the highest rates actually are in Egypt, where in some age groups, especially in the age group of 30 to 50, nearly 1/4 of the population has hepatitis C virus infection. Mongolia has a very high rate, the whole of USSR. Our neighbor Pakistan has a high rate, and some of the countries in the Central Asia also have a very high rate. We fortunately do not have a very high rate. Our rates are less than 0.5%, as is shown in this slide. What happens if you get this infection? When you get infection, let us say at the age of 30, you have acute infection. In some people, the body is able to clear the infection, but in somewhere from 60 to 80%, the virus is not cleared. It persists in the body a bit like HIV. And then over years, it causes chronic inflammation of the liver, leading to a development of cirrhosis and increased risk of development of liver cancer. This takes 20 to 40 years. This arrow is for women who are young at age. If you get infection at older age, in men, in those who use alcohol, who have a co-infection with HIV or another hepatotropic virus such as hepatitis B, the progression occurs much faster. And the problem basically is that once you get infected, the infection persists and it kills you by causing chronic liver disease, and that is the major problem. So people die young. And if we compare the burden of different types of viral hepatitis, hepatitis A and E, overall disease burden is very small because they got acute infection, only a few people die. On the other hand, when we look at hepatitis B and hepatitis C, they are responsible for a large number of deaths due to hepatitis because these are chronic infections which cause cirrhosis and liver cancer. However, HCV is not as big a problem as HBV, but still it causes about 400,000 deaths around the world every year. So once we know all this, what do we do about this infection? The public health response can be in two forms. It can be primary prevention, we prevent infection. And secondly, those who are already infected, if we could do something so that we could stop them from progressing from just infected to having liver cirrhosis or liver cancer, that would work. And first things first, a lot of work was done on prevention. And interestingly, if we see, a lot of it happened even before the virus was discovered. There was a time in 1965 to 1970 when we knew that those who received transfusions developed hepatitis. We had no idea whether this was hepatitis B or hepatitis C. At that time, we believed that everything was hepatitis B. Somewhere in 1970, in the US, a policy of only volunteer blood donors and taking away professional blood donors or replacement blood donors was introduced. Soon thereafter, a test for HBsAg was introduced. So actually this reduction in post-transfusion hepatitis happened even before the HBsAg test was introduced. A lot of this happened because of that, and some happened because of introduction of testing for hepatitis B virus. Things were static thereafter, a major improvement, but no further change. In 1980s, with the advent of HIV, we came to know that there are people who donate blood and they have HIV in their infections, so exclusions were introduced. And we find that the rate of post-transfusion hepatitis comes down. Anti-HIV test became available, it came down further because many of the risk factors for post-transfusion hepatitis were similar to those for HIV. So, and then this is the time when anti-HCV test became available, and after that, the rate has come down even further. And if we look at what proportion was related to B and what was related to C, it becomes apparent that originally what we had, this reduction was not because of HBsAg test introduction. This was basically because of introduction of voluntary blood donors, and that brought down both hepatitis C and hepatitis B with a much larger reduction in hepatitis C. And that tells us the power of public health. Even before a test is available, interventions are possible and we can take care of disease. Same way, other route of prevention was injection safety, safer healthcare procedures, and those were introduced, and that transmission also came down. The problem now was we have a much smaller number of new infections, but there are people who are already infected. What do you do about them? Their outcomes would continue to be poor, and it has been estimated that all over the world, because transfusions became common only in 1960s and 70s, before that transfusions were not widely available, syringes were not widely used, so a lot of people who have HCV infection actually got infected in 1960s and 70s. And because it takes 40 to 50 years for this to cause cirrhosis, therefore the burden of disease will continue to increase even though new infections have been taken care of. And this had continued till the year 2000, so those who got infected in late 1990s would also continue to have a high burden of these diseases and of death till 2050. So then the focus shifted to treatment of those who are already infected. In 1990s, we tried interferon. Some people responded, about 10%. At that time, we thought that was a success. In 1998, came addition of ribavirin to interferon. The response rates improved to about 25%. You can look at glass half full, half empty. Those of us clinicians, we looked at it as glass half full. Public health people looked at it as glass half empty. 2001, people added PEG, polyethylene glycol, to interferon so that the half-life was increased, and there was a huge jump in response rate to 50%. And then, but still we were nowhere. 2011 came some new drugs. Those transiently seemed to help, but we soon found that resistance to those was very common. However, again, we take the help of scientists. We, by this time, knew everything about the virus. We had the viral proteins cloned. We could do bioinformatics. We could find out what are the drugs that could bind to the protein and inhibit. And that technology was used to develop newer drugs, and I'll be coming to that. And when those newer drugs were introduced, also we were able to get rid of interferon, which was associated with a lot of side effects, and we got response rates which were much higher. So the virus has three proteins, the NS3 protease, NS5A protease, and NS5, which is the viral RNA polymerase, and several inhibitors to each have been developed. Some were developed initially, some better ones, and we can now use these drugs from three groups in combinations, and these can take care of the infection. This is the power of molecular biology and the recent methods that have become available that allow us to develop drugs knowing the structure of a protein. When you use these drugs combinations, you get something called as a sustained virological response, which means after you have treated the patient for whatever duration, usually today means 12 weeks, but as newer regimens it also means 6 to 8 weeks, you stop the treatment, and 12 weeks after stopping treatment, if you look for the presence of the viral RNA in a person's blood, it is negative. And we have now data to show that if that happens, it's lifelong cure. The virus does not come back after 3 months. So that is what we are looking at. And if we look at the response rates, if we have a group of people who have HCV infection without cirrhosis, you treat them, the response rates are of the order of 98%, with newer regimens even 99%. Those who already have advanced liver disease, even in them, so they have cirrhosis, but cirrhosis is not decompensated, it is not as bad that it would cause a person to die in the next few months. You can get rid of the infection and their liver function would improve and they could live for several years. Even among those who have HIV co-infection, who have thalassemia, renal failure, who are immunosuppressed, the response rates with these drugs are excellent. So, we started in 1984 with interferon, we progressed along, and then came this genome and these drugs. So, when we came to 2017, and we got these response rates of 90% and above, everybody started thinking in terms of elimination of hepatitis C. Now, elimination is a difficult word, and I would spend 2 slides to explain what we mean by elimination. There are several terms we use: control, elimination, eradication. Control refers to reduction of disease incidence, prevalence, morbidity, or mortality to a locally acceptable level. And this locally acceptable level could differ. Control of measles in Europe could mean very different from what we think as control of measles would be. As a result of deliberate efforts, however, this control is contingent on continued maintenance of the interventions that you are doing. You cannot stop those interventions. By contrast, we have eradication, which means permanent reduction to zero of the occurrence of infection caused by a specific agent worldwide. This is not in a local area. This is all over, a bit like what we have achieved with smallpox and what we wish to achieve for polio. Elimination is something that is nestled in between these 2 terms, which means reduction to zero or below a certain threshold, the incidence of a specific disease in a defined geographical area through deliberate efforts, and then continued interventions would still be needed. And an example that this community should be familiar with is neonatal tetanus or other childhood infections. Can we achieve eradication? I'm not saying elimination here, eradication for HCV. Possibly, yes. It causes infection only in humans. There is no animal reservoir. The virus cannot multiply outside the human body in the environment. The disease is not clearly identifiable per se, because most people don't have any symptoms, but there is an accurate diagnostic tool. We can test the blood, and that test is easy. Now, one thing for eradication criterion is that there should be no chronic carrier stage. That HCV unfortunately does not fulfill. We understand the transmission dynamics. We have methods to interrupt transmission. We don't have a vaccine, but still we can use many tools to control transmission. And there are problems, there are challenges, economic and social, and we'll come to those later. So based on this, WHO decided in 2016 end to embark on a goal of eliminating viral hepatitis, not as a disease, but as a major public health threat in the next 15 years, by 2030. So the targets are somewhat like this. This is the incidence, this is the new infections, and this is for both hepatitis B and C. The target is that from 1915 baseline, new infections will be reduced by 90%, and the mortality, which is not because of just infection, that is because of development of cirrhosis or liver cancer, would be reduced by 65% in the same time frame. And this applies overall as well as to each subgroup as is listed on my slide. And these are the these are the targets, these are the strategies. I'll leave out the first 2 because those are for hepatitis B. For hepatitis C, the main strategies are blood safety, injection safety. So you have safe transfusions, you don't reuse syringes, or you make sure that all medical procedures are safe. The same thing is done for people who inject drugs, and then we test and treat those who already are infected. If we are to achieve a 65% reduction in morbidity and mortality due to hepatitis C, mathematical modeling shows that we need to diagnose 90% of those who are already infected, and we need to treat 80% of those who are tested, found to be positive, and are eligible for treatment. So what are the challenges? Let me put them into 4 groups. Cost of treatment, genotyping. We need people to treat these, healthcare workers to treat these people, and we need to find these cases who are HCV infected. So I'll now share with you some of the work that we have done to facilitate some of these issues. So the problem with HCV treatment was when these new drugs became available, they were extremely costly, of the order of $85,000 for one 12-week course of treatment, one tablet for $1,000. Fortunately for us, given our industry's experience with HIV drugs, and maybe some thought on part of the primary company that made these drugs, several Indian companies were licensed to produce these drugs at a cheap price. And they were able to offer this at that time for about $500 to $600 per treatment. And the question was, however, the government was not convinced, people here were not convinced whether even at that treatment this was a good treatment for a public health program. Because they said, people said there are cost effectiveness data from US, even with that cost it is cost effective, but there are no data from countries such as ours. And we asked a question, not whether it would be cost effective, but whether it would be cost saving. So let me introduce to you some cost effectiveness analysis, or maybe so if you look at the standard treatment and a new treatment, such as the new treatment for hepatitis C, when you treat people, you use certain resources, in particular money, and you get certain outcomes. Same way with the new intervention. If you look at how much of resources you need to spend to get 1 unit benefit, that is expressed as incremental cost effectiveness ratio. This is expressed in a diagram, which is a 2D diagram. In this plane, on the x-axis, we have the effectiveness of treatment or the outcomes that we are interested in. On the y-axis, we have cost. So if the new treatment is more costly and less effective, then there is no point in doing new treatment. On the other hand, if the new treatment is more effective and is also cheaper, it's a win-win situation, so we should be using that treatment. So I'll request you to remember this right lower quadrant, whereas in these two, there could be some issues which I'm not going to go into today. So we undertook an analysis for cost effectiveness of anti-HCV drugs at the prices at which it was available in India. We used some mathematical modeling. This is the Markov state transition model. And we modified, this was available for US, we modified it for India. We took a typical patient who comes to the Indian doctor with HCV infection. So there are different fibrosis stages. A person could have a normal liver, which is not fibrotic. They could progress to mild fibrosis or F1, moderate fibrosis, severe fibrosis or cirrhosis, which is F4. So in a given year, a certain proportion progress, others continue to be in the same state. Those with cirrhosis can go on to develop decompensated cirrhosis or liver cancer and finally liver-related death. Of course, at each stage, some people are dying of unrelated causes. And we made two models. One is if we do not treat people, as I showed you previously, or when we treat people, 95% or whatever proportion will have a response and they will not progress any further, and those who do not have response will progress along this path. We used treatment regimens that were available at that time, the duration of treatment, the response rates with those. The problem with those regimens was that you needed to use different drugs depending on whether the virus was of genotype 1 or 4 or was genotype 3, which means you first need to do genotyping and then treat. We used cost estimates, etc., and these are our results. So our benefits are expressed as quality-adjusted life years, discounted for time, and this is US dollars. And we can see that irrespective of the three genotypes shown with different colors, and whether a person did not have cirrhosis or had cirrhosis, in each situation, this treatment not only improved quality of life, the adjusted life years from 3 to 5, but also saved money. Because these people will now not go on to develop cirrhosis or liver cancer, and we would not have to treat their liver cirrhosis or liver cancer. If we look at how long does it take for those benefits to accrue, overall we found that it will take 10 years. So if you spend on treating 1,000 patients today, within 10 years you would have saved whatever you have spent today. If you look at patients who already have cirrhosis, actually that period was even less than 5 years. So you spend today, and in less than 5 years, you will save all the money that you have spent, which is how a public health program should work. The problem with this was it needed setting up of large labs to do the genotyping, which is a molecular test and very difficult to do. And by that time, a new drug became available, velpatasvir, which could be used irrespective of genotyping, except that it was costlier. And then we undertook an analysis where we compared whether one used a genotype-dependent drug regimen or a genotype-independent drug regimen. And we could say, if there was a particular cost for genotype-dependent regimen, what should be the cost for the genotype independent regimen so that it would be equally costly. And this was used by the government of India and by many other governments to negotiate with those companies and bring the prices of Velpatasvir down. Has this had an effect? Yes. So WHO, which was initially recommending that only people with cirrhosis should be treated, went on to change its recommendation based on our work and work from some other people in 2018 to say that irrespective of cirrhosis, people should be treated. Also, our country has embarked on a viral hepatitis management program. This is being rolled out, and patients are being treated because free of cost. The drugs have just come in, and the program for treatment is just being rolled out. Also, because of increasing use, the cheaper drugs that are available in India have now become available in several countries, shown here in green. The problem then was advocacy. In India, we were able to convince the government that the prices were okay. When this paper was taken to other countries, there was a problem because most health ministers said, that's true for India. Is it true for us? So then, on behalf of WHO, we calculated this website where each country health professionals could go, put in their costs, put in their own epidemiological situation, and the same mathematical model that we had done would run in the background and give them an output which they could show. And because of that, several other countries have gone on to start programs for elimination of hepatitis C. A big problem that remains is healthcare workforce. Today, most of this treatment is being done by hepatologists. That will not work. In India, we have about 6 million people to be treated. How do about 2,000 or 3,000 hepatologists treat them? So this will need to go, just like HIV, to the primary physicians, and they would need to treat this. A lot of training programs are going on, but this needs to be increased. And finally, the problem is the gap in diagnosis. Worldwide, there are about 70 million people estimated to be infected with HCV. We need to diagnose 90% of them if we have to do elimination, but till now we have been able to diagnose only this many. All these need to be diagnosed, which means we'll need to launch big testing programs, and those are going to be costly, and that's where we are. So are we on track to elimination by 2030? WHO, with a lot of fanfare, announced that we would achieve this. There are only a few countries that are on track. We are sadly not in those countries. But maybe not 2030, maybe somewhat later. The path to elimination is clear, and I'm sure this would happen. However, every cloud comes with a silver lining, and every silver lining comes with a cloud. So this is what was happening in the US till I last showed you 2010. And we can see this uptick. This is because of increasing use of IV drugs in the US. That's some of you may be familiar with. And that is leading to a new, much smaller epidemic, but an epidemic. And that seems to pose a challenge whether other countries would have something similar to this. Where are we in India? Again, referring to yesterday, we were talking about a lot of data is available. So people said there are no data. So we undertook this meta-analysis of available data from across the country, more than 100 studies. And we can see that the overall prevalence is only about 0.4%, which means we have about 6 million infected people, and we need to deal with those. The hotspots are here in the northeast and Punjab, possibly because of intravenous drug use. So to summarize, we have this virus called hepatitis C virus, which was first suspected in 1970s, discovered in 1980s, and diagnostic tests became available in 1990s. And in 30 years, we have learned a lot. We know the routes of transmission. We have better diagnostic tests. We know that it has multiple genotypes. We know how to prevent this. We know how to treat this, at least in most people, though we still don't have a vaccine. Actually, those who are working on a vaccine have now realized that there may not be a market for vaccine because we have such beautiful methods to prevent this. The only buyers for a vaccine would be those who are getting intravenous drug use. And those people generally don't buy vaccines and take vaccines. So vaccine attempts have actually virtually been given up. These public health measures in the form of prevention and treatment that we know, if we apply these extensively, we can eliminate HCV as a public health problem. However, to reach this goal, we will need to upscale our response, and if we do that, it should be possible. Thank you.